It was a bright morning when Marcus Allen parked his old black sedan outside the courthouse of a small southern town. He had driven 3 hours from the city, rehearsing his case in his head again and again. It was not just another day for him. It was his first appearance in this county court. His suit was neatly pressed, his briefcase filled with documents carefully arranged in order. He took a deep breath, looked up at the tall white building before him and whispered to himself, "Just stay calm and do your best." Inside, the courthouse smelled of old wood and coffee. The people sitting on the benches turned to look at him as he walked in. Some eyes were curious, some indifferent, but a few carried a hint of disbelief. Marcus walked toward the front, set his briefcase on the table, and waited quietly for the session to begin. The bailiff called the court to order, and then Judge Robert Hensley entered. He was a man in his late 60s with sharp eyes and a serious expression. He carried the kind of authority that made everyone sit a little straighter. Marcus stood and introduced himself with a calm, respectful voice. "Good morning, Your Honor." Marcus Allen, representing the defendant. For a moment there was silence. The judge raised his head slowly and looked over his glasses at the young man standing before him. "You're representing the defendant?" he asked in a tone that sounded more like disbelief than a question. Marcus nodded politely. A faint smirk crossed the judge's face. "Well," he said, tapping his pen on the desk, "I hope your city training prepared you for real courtrooms." A few quiet laughs came from the back. Marcus heard them, but he didn't react. He kept his posture straight and his face calm. Inside, he felt a mix of embarrassment and determination. He knew that in moments like this, silence spoke louder than words. He opened his file and began presenting his first motion clearly and confidently. As the hearing went on, Marcus could sense the judge's impatience. Every time Marcus spoke, Judge Hensley interrupted him. "Counselor, that's not how we do things here," the judge said, cutting him off mid-sentence. "This is not one of those fancy city courts." Marcus paused and nodded respectfully. "Understood, Your Honor," he said softly, then continued his argument. He cited legal precedents, quoted sections of law, and stayed on point. Yet each time the judge found a reason to challenge him, not on facts but on form. The other lawyers sitting in the courtroom exchanged quiet looks. One whispered to another, "He's new. Hensley's going to eat him alive." Another replied under his breath, "He shouldn't have come alone." Marcus heard none of it. He focused on his papers, his voice steady. He was determined not to lose his composure. He had worked too hard to let frustration ruin this moment. When his client, an elderly schoolteacher named Mrs. Cooper, looked at him nervously, Marcus smiled at her reassuringly. "It's all right," he whispered. "We'll be fine." The judge leaned forward again. "Mr. Allen," he said, drawing out the name slowly, "where did you say you studied law?" Marcus looked up. "Harvard Law School, Your Honor." That answer caused another ripple of whispers in the courtroom. Judge Hensley raised an eyebrow. "Harvard, eh? Well, I suppose they don't teach common sense there." A few chuckles followed. Marcus could feel the warmth rising in his face, but he still didn't react. He took a breath, smiled faintly, and continued his statement as if nothing had happened. He knew he couldn't change the judge's attitude with words. The only way was through performance, through excellence, patience, and dignity. As the morning went on, Marcus presented evidence piece by piece. He explained each point clearly, linking facts to the law. But every time he gained ground, the judge would interject or mock some small detail. It wasn't about the case anymore, it was personal. "Counselor," the judge said with exaggerated politeness, "perhaps you'd like to explain that again. We don't all speak big city language here." Marcus simply nodded. "Of course, Your Honor," he said, and repeated his point with the same calm tone. The courtroom stayed quiet this time. Some people began to notice his patience. He wasn't arguing. He wasn't breaking. He was just doing his job with quiet confidence. During a short recess, Marcus walked out into the hallway to clear his head. He stood near the coffee machine, staring at the tiled floor. Two older attorneys stood nearby, speaking in low voices. One said, "You think the judge is giving him a fair shot?" The other replied, "Hensley? He's old-fashioned. Doesn't like outsiders, especially ones who look like that." Marcus turned slightly, but said nothing. Their words didn't surprise him. He had faced quiet assumptions before. What mattered was not proving them wrong. It was proving himself right. He went back into the courtroom and sat down. Mrs. Cooper whispered. I'm sorry, Mr. Allen. You shouldn't have to go through this because of me. Marcus smiled gently. Ma'am, this is not your fault. We're here for justice, and justice doesn't care where a person comes from. It cares what's true. Her eyes softened and she nodded. For the first time, Marcus felt a small wave of calm wash over him. When the judge returned, Marcus stood again. He started summarizing his legal argument. His tone was steady, his words clear. Every sentence he spoke carried both intelligence and restraint. But again, the judge interrupted him halfway through. Son, maybe you should take a little time to study how we handle procedures down here. Marcus paused, then said gently, Thank you, Your Honor. I will always welcome a chance to learn. The room grew quiet. There was something in his tone that silenced even the judge for a moment. It wasn't defiance, it was simple grace. Marcus went on to finish his statement. As he did, something shifted in the room. A few of the lawyers who had laughed earlier now watched him differently. They saw a man who refused to be shaken. His calmness, his professionalism, it was quietly commanding. When the hearing ended for the day, Judge Hensley said, We'll reconvene tomorrow morning. He looked down at his papers, avoiding Marcus's eyes. Marcus packed his briefcase slowly. As he walked toward the exit, one of the clerks stepped aside and said softly, You did well, sir. Marcus gave a small nod and smiled. Outside, the sun was beginning to set behind the courthouse. Marcus stood by his car for a moment, letting the cool wind brush his face. The day had been long, heavy, and full of quiet battles. But he felt no anger, only purpose. He looked up at the courthouse again and whispered, Tomorrow, the truth will speak for itself. Then he opened his car door, sat down, and began preparing for the next day. That night in his motel room, Marcus stayed awake, reading through pages of case law by lamplight. His pen scribbled notes across the margins. He wasn't just preparing to win. He was preparing to make a point that went beyond this courtroom. A point about dignity, about professionalism, about respect. He knew that sometimes the most powerful answer to disrespect was silence followed by undeniable skill. And deep down he believed that no matter how much mockery he faced, sooner or later, his work would make them see who he really was. As midnight passed, he closed his book, looked out the window at the dark sky, and smiled faintly. They'll see tomorrow, he whispered to himself. They'll all see. And with that quiet determination burning in his heart, Marcus turned off the light, ready to face whatever came next. The next morning, the town courthouse looked calm under the rising sun. The air was cool and the smell of fresh coffee came from the small cafe across the street. Marcus Allen sat in his car for a few minutes before walking in. He straightened his tie, checked his papers once more, and whispered to himself, Stay calm, Marcus. Today let your work speak. He had hardly slept, but his mind was clear. He knew the case better than anyone in that courtroom. When he entered the courtroom, people were already there. Lawyers chatting in low voices, a few townsfolk sitting on benches, and the old clock ticking softly on the wall. Mrs. Cooper, his client, gave him a nervous smile. Marcus smiled back, gently patting her hand. We'll be fine today, he said softly. Judge Hensley walked in soon after, his robe flowing as he took his seat. Court is now in session, he announced. His voice filled the room. Marcus could tell the judge remembered yesterday's hearing. There was a look in his eyes, a mix of authority and irritation. Mr. Allen, the judge said in a slow voice, I trust you reviewed our court procedures last night? Yes, Your Honor, Marcus replied politely. And I'm ready to continue. The judge nodded, flipping through his papers. Let's hope for a smoother session today, he said, glancing at Marcus in a way that drew a few quiet laughs from the back of the room. Marcus stood tall, opened his file, and began. Your Honor, I would like to present additional evidence supporting my client's innocence, he said, passing a document to the clerk. This report clearly shows that the accusation against Mrs. Cooper is based on incorrect data. The judge looked at the paper briefly, then said, You're claiming the county record is wrong? Yes, Your Honor. The dates in the witness statement don't match. This document, Mr. Allen, the judge interrupted. Do you realize what you're implying? That our local records are inaccurate? That's a strong statement from an outsider. Marcus paused. He chose his words carefully. I'm only saying, Your Honor, that the truth should guide us all, no matter where it leads. There was a soft murmur from the benches. The judge leaned back, clearly not used to being challenged, even respectfully. Fine, he said. Let's see how this goes. Marcus continued his presentation, explaining point by point how his client's records showed a mistake in the county's report. His calm, clear voice filled the room. But every few minutes the judge interrupted him again, sometimes to question his methods, other times to make a sharp remark. Mr. Allen, he said once, maybe where you come from people like to complicate things. Here we keep it simple. Marcus looked at him respectfully and said, Simplicity and truth often walk together, Your Honor. That short reply caused a brief silence. Even the court clerk looked up. Marcus could see the judge's expression tighten, but he said nothing. When Marcus finished speaking, the prosecutor, an older local attorney named Mr. Garrison, stood up with a confident smile. Your Honor, with all due respect to Mr. Allen's impressive vocabulary, we trust the county's records. We've used them for decades. If there's a mistake, I'm sure it isn't here. The judge nodded, agreed. Let's not overcomplicate this. Marcus wanted to respond, but he knew arguing now would not help. Instead, he calmly gathered his papers. I understand, Your Honor. May I call my next witness? The judge sighed but agreed. When Mrs. Cooper took the stand, her voice trembled at first, but Marcus gently guided her with patience. He asked questions slowly, clearly, helping her tell her side of the story. The courtroom began to see something different. Not a fancy lawyer trying to impress, but a man genuinely fighting for justice. At one point, Mrs. Cooper said softly, I've been teaching children in this town for 35 years. I'd never do what they're saying. Her voice cracked slightly. The room fell quiet. Marcus looked at her and then turned toward the judge. Your Honor, her record shows a life of honesty and service. Sometimes numbers fail to see the heart behind the story. The judge shifted in his chair but said nothing. When the cross-examination started, the prosecutor tried to confuse Mrs. Cooper with fast questions, but Marcus objected firmly each time the questions turned unfair. Objection, Your Honor. The question is leading. Sustained, the judge said once reluctantly. For the first time, Marcus noticed a slight change. The judge's tone was less mocking, a little more neutral. During the lunch break, Marcus walked outside and sat on the courthouse steps. The warm sun touched his face. He saw people passing by. Some looked at him with respect now, others with curiosity. He didn't mind either. All he cared about was the case. 2 local lawyers approached him. One said quietly, You handled yourself well in there. Most folks lose their temper with Hensley the first day. The other added, He pushes people to see if they'll crack. Marcus smiled politely. Then maybe patience is the only way to win. They nodded and walked away. Marcus stayed there for a moment, sipping water and reading through his notes again. Inside he felt calm, but he knew something was building. There was a moment coming, he could sense it, where truth would finally stand taller than pride. When the court resumed in the afternoon, Marcus presented his final arguments for the day. He cited legal precedents from various courts to support his point. Each citation was clear, professional, and strong, but when he mentioned a well-known Supreme Court case, Judge Hensley leaned forward again. Mr. Allen, he said sharply, you seem to enjoy quoting big courts, but let me remind you, this is a small county courtroom, not Washington, D.C. Marcus looked up respectfully. Yes, Your Honor, but the law is the same everywhere, city or county. Justice does not change its name when we cross borders. That single sentence sent a quiet wave through the room. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Even the bailiff gave a small nod before quickly looking away. The judge looked at Marcus for a long moment, then cleared his throat and said, We'll continue tomorrow. Court adjourned. He struck the gavel and walked out without another word. Marcus packed his papers slowly. Mrs. Cooper turned to him with tears in her eyes. You were amazing today, she whispered. I don't know how you stay so calm. Marcus smiled. It's not about pride, ma'am. It's about peace. If I lose my calm, I lose the truth. As they walked out together, the courthouse hallway was almost empty. The afternoon light fell through the windows, painting long golden lines across the floor. The janitor near the door paused and said, Sir, I heard what you said in there. That was real courage, Marcus gave a small nod. Thank you. But courage is just doing what's right, even when no one claps. Outside, he stood beside his car again, the same spot where he had stood the day before. He looked back at the courthouse and thought about the day's events. The laughter, the remarks, the quiet shifts in attitude. He had seen a small change, not in the law but in hearts. As the sun dipped lower, Marcus thought about tomorrow's hearing. He knew the judge would test him again. But he also knew something else. The truth had started to shine through. And when the truth began to shine, no one could stop it from spreading. That night in his motel room, Marcus opened his laptop and reviewed his notes again. On the screen was a document, one he had helped write years ago when he worked at the Supreme Court as part of a legal research team. The case name at the top matched the precedent he had mentioned in court that day. He looked at it for a long moment, then smiled. "Tomorrow," he said softly to himself. "Maybe I'll remind them where I came from." He closed the laptop, leaned back in the chair, and listened to the soft hum of the ceiling fan. The storm had not yet passed, but Marcus knew it was turning. He felt ready for what came next. The truth was on his side, and tomorrow everyone would see it clearly. The next morning began with quiet tension in the courthouse. The sky was gray and the air smelled of rain. Marcus Allen arrived early, dressed in the same navy suit but with a sharper focus in his eyes. He had prepared all night, studying every document and piece of evidence. Today, he wasn't just defending a case, he was defending dignity itself. Inside the courtroom, people whispered as he walked in. Word had spread about the previous day's session. Some admired how calmly he handled the judge's remarks. Others wondered if he would finally lose his temper today. But Marcus moved with quiet confidence, nodding politely to the clerk and setting his files in perfect order. When Judge Hensley entered, the sound of his gavel filled the room. "Court is now in session," he said firmly. His tone was clipped, his face unreadable. He looked down at his notes, then at Marcus. "Mr. Allen, I hope today's proceedings will stay within the boundaries of our local court decorum." "Yes, Your Honor," Marcus replied calmly. "That's my goal as well." The prosecutor smiled faintly, certain that the young lawyer would falter again. But Marcus wasn't rattled. He began to speak, his voice smooth and clear. "Your Honor, before continuing with the witness testimony, I would like to present a legal precedent that supports my client's position regarding the county's administrative error." Judge Hensley sighed. "Another big city case?" Marcus smiled faintly. "A federal one, actually." He opened a folder and handed a copy to the clerk. "This is the Supreme Court ruling from last year in Henderson versus State Commission. It discusses how an administrative misreporting, if proven, invalidates subsequent charges." The judge frowned and skimmed through the pages. "Mr. Allen," he said slowly, "I'm not sure this applies. You're reaching quite far." "With respect, Your Honor," Marcus replied, "this ruling set the standard nationwide. If local courts ignore it, we risk denying fairness." The judge leaned forward, his patience thinning. "And how exactly would you know that, Counselor?" Marcus looked directly at him, his tone still polite but firm. "Because I worked on that ruling, Your Honor." The courtroom went silent. The faint sound of rain tapping the windows was the only noise. The judge blinked. "You worked on it?" "Yes," Marcus said, keeping his voice calm and even. "I was part of the legal research team assisting one of the Supreme Court justices. My role was to analyze precedent and prepare briefing summaries for this specific case." A wave of murmurs spread across the courtroom. The same people who had laughed quietly in the past 2 days now turned to each other in surprise. Even the prosecutor froze for a moment. Judge Hensley stared at Marcus, trying to process what he'd just heard. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that you were involved in drafting Supreme Court opinions?" "That's correct, Your Honor," Marcus replied. "Before I took this pro bono case, I was working in Washington as a clerk under the Supreme Court Legal Research Division. This case, Mrs. Cooper's case, was part of a program I volunteered for. I wanted to support smaller communities where justice sometimes gets overlooked." The judge's face changed completely. The mocking tone disappeared. The courtroom was silent again, but the silence felt heavy this time, like respect slowly replacing doubt. After a long pause, the judge cleared his throat. "Proceed, Counselor," he said, his voice softer now. "You may continue." Marcus nodded, picked up his notes, and walked to the center of the courtroom. His steps were steady. The authority in his voice was quiet but commanding. "As I was saying, Your Honor, This precedent clearly establishes that administrative records cannot override constitutional fairness. In Mrs. Cooper's case, we have identical circumstances. He began explaining each paragraph of the ruling, pointing to the exact sentences that matched his client's defense. The judge listened closely, no longer interrupting. Even the prosecutor stayed silent, his earlier confidence gone. As Marcus spoke, people began to see the real story unfolding. This wasn't just a young lawyer struggling for respect. This was a man who had helped shape the very laws that guided the judge himself. Mrs. Cooper, sitting quietly behind him, wiped her eyes. She looked at Marcus with pride and gratitude. For the first time since her arrest, she believed the truth would win. When Marcus finished his explanation, he handed another document to the clerk. "This," he said, "is my written analysis of the precedent, authenticated and time-stamped during my tenure in Washington. It's public record." Judge Hensley flipped through the pages slowly. His earlier pride now seemed replaced by humility. "Mr. Allen," he said after a pause, "I owe you an apology. I may have misjudged your experience." Marcus smiled kindly. "No apology needed, Your Honor. We all learn from each other. That's the beauty of the law." The room stayed still for a few seconds before the judge nodded. "You're right. Let's proceed fairly." When the prosecutor tried to respond, his voice wavered. "Your Honor, I need to review this new information." "Take your time," the judge said quickly. "Mr. Allen, continue." From that moment on, the atmosphere changed. The mockery was gone. Every word Marcus spoke carried weight. His earlier patience now looked like strength. His calmness, once mistaken for weakness, was now seen as confidence. He walked through the evidence again, showing how the county's data error had led to Mrs. Cooper's false charge. Each explanation was simple but sharp. He didn't boast, didn't raise his voice, he just told the truth. When he was done, the judge looked thoughtful. "Mr. Allen," he said, "your presentation was exceptional. I'll need time to review all of this, but I appreciate your clarity and professionalism." Marcus nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor. That's all I ever wanted." The judge slowly removed his glasses and sighed. "You know," he said quietly, "I've seen many lawyers come through this courtroom. Few handle themselves with such grace. It seems I have more to learn than I thought." A small smile crossed Marcus's face. "We all do, Your Honor." When the session ended, no one moved right away. The silence was filled with quiet admiration. Even the clerk, who had once smirked at him, walked over and said softly, "Sir, that was incredible." Outside the courthouse, the rain had stopped. Marcus stepped onto the wet steps, feeling the cool air brush his face. The gray clouds were breaking apart, letting soft sunlight through. As he stood there, an older lawyer approached him, one of the same men who had whispered about him earlier in the week. "Mr. Allen," the man said humbly, "I didn't know who you really were. I judged too soon." Marcus smiled warmly. "That's all right. It happens to all of us." The man nodded slowly. "You handled that, Judge, better than anyone I've ever seen. You didn't raise your voice once." Marcus looked back toward the courthouse door and said softly, "Sometimes the best way to change a room is to stay calm until the truth speaks for itself." He walked down the steps and helped Mrs. Cooper to her car. She looked at him with tears in her eyes. "You're more than a lawyer, Mr. Allen," she said. "You're a light in a dark place." He chuckled softly. "I'm just someone who believes the law should protect everyone, no matter where they come from." As they drove away, the courthouse stood tall behind them, but the weight inside had shifted forever. The people who had doubted him would never forget the day they saw the young lawyer stand with such quiet power, not because he shouted, but because he proved that dignity and truth can be stronger than prejudice. That night, Marcus sat by the window of his small motel room, watching the rain fall again. He felt no pride, only peace. What mattered wasn't that he had impressed a courtroom. What mattered was that he had reminded everyone, including himself, that respect, once earned through grace, can change even the hardest hearts. He leaned back in his chair, closed his notebook, and whispered to himself, "Justice always finds its way, if we stay patient enough to let it." The following day, the courthouse felt different from before. The people inside were quieter, more careful, as if the air carried a new kind of respect. The gossip and laughter that had once filled the benches were gone. Now, when Marcus Allen entered the courtroom, every eye followed him, but not with mockery. There was curiosity, admiration, and even guilt among some who had laughed at him earlier. Marcus walked with calm confidence, the same briefcase in his hand, the same neatly pressed navy suit. But something in the way people looked at him told him that everything had changed. Mrs. Cooper smiled softly when he approached her table. "They know now," she whispered. Marcus smiled back. "That's not what matters," he said gently. "What matters is justice." When Judge Hensley entered, the entire courtroom rose as usual, but the judge's steps were slower, his expression more thoughtful. He adjusted his glasses, nodded to Marcus, and said, "Good morning, Mr. Allen." "Good morning, Your Honor," Marcus replied. His tone was polite, the same as always, but this time, the judge's voice carried warmth, something that had been missing before. The hearing began, and the judge's tone was completely different from the first 2 days. He listened carefully, asked reasonable questions, and even complimented Marcus when he made a clear point. The prosecutor noticed it too. His confidence had shrunk. He kept glancing at Marcus nervously, no longer smirking or whispering with his assistants. Marcus began presenting his final pieces of evidence, financial statements, school records, and local documents proving that Mrs. Cooper had no part in the administrative error. Every word he said was backed by facts, and every fact came with quiet certainty. At one point the judge asked, "Mr. Allen, could you explain how this document connects to your earlier reference from the federal ruling?" Marcus nodded and walked to the large screen beside the witness box. He projected a section of the Supreme Court judgment and pointed to a paragraph. "Here, Your Honor, it clearly states that when a local record contradicts verified data from a federal or state source, the higher record takes precedence. This means Mrs. Cooper's record, signed and confirmed at the state level, must override the county's mistaken entry." Judge Hensley leaned back and nodded slowly. "I see," he said quietly. "That's very clear." The courtroom was silent, everyone hanging on his words. Even the sound of the old ceiling fan above them felt louder in the stillness. The prosecutor stood to cross-examine but stumbled over his words. "Well, Your Honor, I believe the county still has—" He trailed off, knowing there was no ground left to stand on. Marcus didn't gloat. He just stepped back, hands clasped in front of him, patient and calm as ever. For a few seconds, the judge said nothing. He stared at the papers before him, then looked up at Marcus again. His voice softened when he spoke. "Mr. Allen," he said, "you've conducted yourself with great professionalism. I admit I underestimated you." Marcus simply replied, "We all learn, Your Honor. Every day the law teaches us something new." The judge gave a faint smile and nodded. "Indeed." When the time came for closing statements, the prosecutor gave a short, hesitant argument. He repeated a few points about the county's procedures, but his voice lacked conviction. Then it was Marcus's turn. He stood slowly, buttoned his jacket, and looked at the judge, not with pride, but with quiet respect. "Your Honor," he began, "I know this courtroom has seen many cases, some small, some significant, but the heart of every case is truth. My client, Mrs. Cooper, has dedicated her life to teaching young minds to believe in honesty, fairness, and kindness, and now she stands here hoping for that same fairness to protect her." He paused for a moment. The courtroom was utterly still. Then he continued, "The evidence is simple. The mistake is clear. And I believe this court stands for what's right, not just for what's easy." His words carried a sincerity that filled the room. Even those who didn't understand the law could feel the weight of his heart behind every sentence. When he finished, he nodded politely and sat down. The judge looked at him for a long moment before saying, "Thank you, Mr. Allen." His voice had changed completely, soft, thoughtful, almost humble. The judge announced a short recess before giving his decision. As he left, the room buzzed quietly. The same people who had once whispered insults now whispered admiration. "Did you see the way he handled that?" someone murmured. "He never raised his voice once," said another. "He could have shown off, but he didn't." Mrs. Cooper turned to Marcus with tears in her eyes. "Whatever happens, you've already won my heart, young man," she said. Marcus smiled warmly. "You've already done enough, ma'am. Teaching generations to believe in good, that's your legacy." When the judge returned, the courtroom went silent again. He adjusted his glasses and began reading his notes. After reviewing all the evidence and considering both arguments, he said slowly, "This court finds Mrs. Cooper not guilty of any wrongdoing." A collective sigh of relief filled the room. Mrs. Cooper covered her face with her hands, crying softly. Marcus smiled but said nothing. The judge continued. The county's administrative record will be corrected immediately and all charges dismissed. He paused, then looked at Marcus again. Mr. Allen, I also want to acknowledge your composure and your dedication to justice. I misjudged you and I'll remember this lesson for the rest of my career. Marcus stood respectfully. Thank you, Your Honor. That means a lot. The judge nodded and struck the gavel gently. Court adjourned. The moment he did, the room filled with applause, not loud or wild, but warm and sincere. Even the clerk clapped. The prosecutor walked over, extended his hand, and said, You've earned my respect, Counselor. Marcus shook his hand kindly. Thank you. That's all I ever ask. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun shone bright after days of rain. The air was fresh and everything felt lighter. Reporters from a small local paper approached Marcus asking for a few words. He smiled and said, There's no victory without humility. This was not about proving anyone wrong. It was about proving that respect and fairness should always come first. Mrs. Cooper stood beside him, still emotional. I wish every lawyer was like you, she said. Calm, kind, and strong. Marcus chuckled softly. I just do my best, ma'am. The truth usually does the rest. As they walked toward the parking lot, several people who had once doubted him came forward to shake his hand. Some apologized. Others simply thanked him. The janitor, who had been sweeping the floor near the door, smiled and said, Sir, that was something to see. You didn't just win a case, you changed a room. Marcus stopped for a second, looked at the man, and said quietly, Change doesn't come from loud voices. It comes from quiet truth. Later that evening, Marcus sat alone on a bench outside the courthouse. The sky was painted orange and gold as the sun set behind the trees. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes for a moment, feeling peace fill his heart. He thought about everything that had happened, the laughter, the humiliation, the turning point, and finally the respect. It wasn't about pride. It was about grace. It was about showing that patience could speak louder than anger, and that calm strength could defeat even the deepest prejudice. As the last rays of sunlight faded, Marcus whispered to himself, Justice isn't about who's louder, it's about who stands firm in truth. He stood up, picked up his briefcase, and walked toward his car. Behind him, the courthouse glowed softly in the evening light. No longer just a place of judgment, but a place where change had quietly begun. Days passed after the verdict, but the story of what happened in that small courthouse didn't stay quiet for long. Word spread quickly across the town, then across the whole county, about the young black lawyer who had stood tall, calm, and graceful in front of a harsh judge and turned a courtroom full of doubt into a place of respect. People who had been there couldn't stop talking about it. Clerks whispered the story to friends. Other lawyers repeated it at lunch meetings. Even the janitor proudly told everyone he had seen it with his own eyes. But for Marcus Allen, the man at the center of it all, life returned to normal. Or at least that's how he wanted it. He went back to his quiet apartment in the city, where shelves were filled with books on law and history. The same briefcase that had carried his documents during the trial now sat on his desk. He didn't see himself as a hero. In his mind, he had simply done what any honest lawyer should do, stand for truth and remain calm no matter what. One morning, a knock came at his office door. When he opened it, he was surprised to see an envelope addressed to him, sealed with a gold emblem. Inside was a letter from the state judicial office. It was signed by none other than Judge Robert Hensley. Marcus sat down and unfolded the letter carefully. It read, Mr. Allen, I have been a judge for over 30 years, and I must confess that until recently, I thought I had nothing left to learn about fairness or humility. But after meeting you, I realized I was wrong. You reminded me that justice is not about power. It's about respect. I want to thank you for showing me, through your patience and grace, what true professionalism means. Sincerely, Judge Robert Hensley. Marcus read the letter twice, then placed it back in the envelope. He didn't smile or boast. Instead, he closed his eyes and whispered softly, That's what change looks like. Later that week, he returned to the same town for one last visit. Mrs. Cooper had invited him to the small school where she taught for decades. When he arrived, the students were waiting with handmade signs that read, Thank you, Mr. Allen. And justice wins. The children clapped as he entered, their young faces full of joy. Mrs. Cooper walked up to him with tears in her eyes. "You saved my name," she said softly. "And you reminded all of us that kindness still lives in the world." Marcus smiled humbly. "You saved it yourself, ma'am. I just helped others see what was already true." She laughed gently and handed him a small box. "The children wanted you to have this," she said. Inside was a simple wooden plaque with his name carved in the center. Marcus Allen, Defender of Truth. He looked at it quietly for a few seconds, deeply moved. "Tell them thank you," he said, "and tell them to always believe in fairness no matter how small they feel." That evening, Marcus stopped by the courthouse one last time before leaving town. The sun was setting behind the building, painting the white walls in shades of orange and gold. The steps where he once stood alone now looked peaceful. As he stood there, the bailiff came out and saw him. "Mr. Allen," he said with a respectful smile. "I didn't think I'd see you again." Marcus shook his hand. "Just passing by," he said. "I wanted to see it one more time." The bailiff nodded. "You know, things have changed here since you came. The judge, he's different now. He listens more. People say he even holds workshops for young attorneys about respect and fairness." Marcus looked thoughtful. "That's good to hear," he said softly. "That's the real victory." As he turned to leave, the bailiff added, "Sir, I just wanted to say, what you did here meant a lot to many of us. You showed everyone that calm can be stronger than anger." Marcus smiled kindly. "Sometimes quiet words travel farther than shouts," he said. When he got back to his car, he sat inside for a moment, staring at the steering wheel. The radio was off. The world outside felt calm. He thought about how the entire journey had started with laughter and prejudice, and how it ended with respect and learning. He started the engine but didn't drive right away. He was lost in thought, remembering every moment. The judge's smirk, the mockery, the moment of silence when he revealed his past, and the judge's changed tone afterward. Every step had mattered. That night, as he returned to the city, he received a call from a local news reporter. The reporter's voice was warm and enthusiastic. "Mr. Allen, we'd love to feature your story. The way you handled that courtroom, it's inspiring people across the state. Would you agree to an interview?" Marcus chuckled softly. "I'm not sure I'm the story," he said. "The real story is about how respect can change people. I was just part of that lesson." The reporter insisted, "Still, sir, people need to hear your side. It's giving young lawyers hope." After a moment of silence, Marcus agreed. "All right, but if you write about me," he said, "make sure you also write about the woman I represented. She's proof that ordinary people can stand for truth and win." The article was published a week later with the headline, "Calm in the Courtroom? How One Lawyer Changed a Judge's Heart." The story went viral in legal circles, appearing in newsletters, forums, and even a few television interviews. Law students studied it as an example of emotional intelligence and dignity under pressure. Judges shared it in conferences. And across the country, many young lawyers began to see that real strength wasn't in raising your voice. It was in controlling it. But Marcus never used his fame. He stayed humble, continued his work quietly, and often took pro bono cases for small towns that couldn't afford big city representation. When people praised him, he always said, "Justice doesn't need fame. It needs faith." Months later, Judge Hensley invited Marcus to speak at a regional conference for judges and lawyers. When Marcus walked on stage, the audience stood and clapped. The judge himself introduced him, saying, "This man taught me more in 1 week than 30 years of judging ever did." Marcus took the podium, smiled gently, and said, "I didn't come here to teach anyone. I came to remind us all. Respect is the foundation of justice. Without it, even the strongest law will crumble." The room fell silent, hanging on every word. "We can't control how others treat us," he continued, "but we can control how we respond. And when we respond with grace, we don't just win a case, we win hearts." The crowd erupted in applause. But even then, Marcus stayed modest. After the event, a young law student approached him nervously and said, "Mr. Allen, how did you stay calm when the judge was being unfair?" Marcus smiled kindly. "I remembered that anger only feeds unfairness," he said, "but patience starves it." The student nodded slowly, as if the words had opened something inside him. That night, Marcus returned to his hotel and looked out at the city lights. He thought of Mrs. Cooper, the children, the judge, and the people who had learned something from that small courtroom. He realized that sometimes, One simple act of grace could ripple out farther than anyone expected. As the lights shimmered in the distance, Marcus whispered to himself, "One case can end, but the lesson never should." He leaned back in his chair, a peaceful smile on his face. Somewhere far away, another courtroom would open the next morning. Another young lawyer would stand before a stern judge, and perhaps because of his story, that judge would pause, just for a moment, and remember the quiet man who taught the world that dignity could be stronger than prejudice. And with that thought, Marcus turned off the lamp, closed his eyes, and let sleep take him, content, knowing that justice once awakened would never stop spreading.